DevilNeverCry.
Are Square Enix truly worried about Final Fantasy XVI's pre-order numbers, or is it all being blown out of proportion? Yesterday, a post went up from a reliable games industry insider stating that Square Enix were panicking slightly over Final Fantasy XVI's pre-order numbers. What exactly could cause this panic? Well, it turns out that Final Fantasy XVI apparently is tracking behind the numbers Final Fantasy XV did, even when you account for the fact that Final Fantasy XVI is launching on a lower number of platforms. Though the post did come with somewhat of a caveat, perhaps in an attempt to stop things from blowing out of proportion, that these are only pre-order numbers that represent guaranteed day one sales, and so the actual total sales for Final Fantasy XVI could still blow everyone away and blow Final Fantasy XV out of the water. So to put things in simpler terms, apparently the game's pre-order numbers aren't where Square Enix think they should be. I don't necessarily see why this is that much of an issue. Quite honestly, as the post has mentioned, a large portion of the sales are likely to come from the release day itself, not necessarily pre-orders. I think with the way the industry is headed, with the amount of launches that we've had where games have been broken, people are becoming more and more wary of pre-ordering games as they don't want to be burned once more. But immediately, of course, the internet does what it does best and basically takes a headline or a statement and just absolutely runs wild with it. People have been blaming the fact that this isn't turn-based and gone full action as to why people aren't pre-ordering, or the fact that you can't control a full party, the fact that, it's medieval high fantasy Final Fantasy as opposed to futuristic Final Fantasy, all kinds of things, as opposed to trying to make logical deductions as to why these numbers might be lower. Ultimately, while I do feel that the team at Square Enix likely is under pressure for this game to perform well financially, I'd imagine that that is the case for literally every single game out there and pretty much every single company that makes a product. They want that product to do well financially, and so they're going to be sweating over numbers if they're not necessarily 100% in line with where they would expect them to be. Honestly, the demo can't come soon enough. I think with the demo releasing and it being in the hands of the public, that these kind of hyperbolic statements and comments are likely to just die off entirely. I'm betting that Square Enix are banking as well on good word of mouth from having played the demo or from having watched streamers play it to do a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to marketing this game. Moving on to another Final Fantasy entirely, however, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth has once more made its way to the forefront of gamers' minds as the Twitter account has finally started dropping small nuggets of information in regards to Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, with it seemingly being one piece of information a day, likely perhaps leading up and coinciding with the launch of Summer Game Fest, which perhaps implies that we might see it make an appearance there. Summer Game Fest kicks off on June the 8th. If we factor in all the posts from the FF account that we've seen already, and the days to come, it seems as though the 7th post from Final Fantasy VII about Final Fantasy VII Rebirth will drop on the day of Summer Game Fest's debut. It could merely be a coincidence, or it might be something more. I guess we'll just have to wait and see to find out. Going back to what was actually discussed, however, the first piece of information comes from the producer himself, Yoshinori Kitase, who mentions that development of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is progressing smoothly and according to plan, and that Square Enix is currently working on nailing down a finalized release date for the game. For those of you who don't know or perhaps can't quite remember, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth was scheduled for a winter 2023 release. That means it could release by the end of 2023, or perhaps it could be released in the first quarter of 2024 before the winter season ends. The second developer comment comes from Final Fantasy VII Rebirth's director Naoki Hamaguchi, where the question states, how will players journey through the world outside of Midgar in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth? I think it's commendable that Square Enix aren't wasting time and getting straight to the matters at hand, knowing exactly what it is that people want to hear the answer to. FF7 Remake, or Trilogy Part 1, whatever you want to call it, was quite linear, specifically because the entire game played out within the confines of the walls of Midgar City, and that made sense. The story played out there and it was largely faithful to the original game. But as we all know, or as most of us know at this point, Final Fantasy VII opens up massively after the opening Midgar section, and we're wondering if that's going to be the case with Rebirth or Part 2. They're not going to be able to still have that open world, surely, right? Well, the answer we get is quite vague, but I guess at the same time quite promising. Players will be able to journey across the wide and multifaceted world with a high degree of freedom, experiencing a myriad of different stories along the way. The first thing that my eyes are drawn to is the fact that they state that it's going to be a multifaceted world with a high degree of freedom. That basically tells us that it's not going to be open world. If this game was open world, they would be screaming it to the high heavens, just like they did with Final Fantasy XV. And that isn't necessarily a bad thing. I mean, look at how Final Fantasy XV's open world turned out to be. And if you want a more positive example, look at Final Fantasy XVI, a game that isn't open world and is shaping up to be quite promising. Taking a look at the second part of that statement, specifically where Hamaguchi mentions a myriad of different stories and being able to experience them, that to me sounds like they're going to be taking things that were optional in the original Final Fantasy VII, things that you could perhaps stumble upon and weren't necessarily needed to be found before you got to the end of the game, and somehow organically weaving that into Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, despite it being somewhat more linear and railroaded in its design. Moving on back to Final Fantasy XVI to round out the video, let's briefly talk about the new gameplay that surfaced, featuring the Liquid Flame boss fight. IGN recently put a gameplay video out which featured Clive and Jill facing off against the Liquid Flame somewhere, I believe, in the Iron Kingdom. By the way, if you haven't seen it already, I wholeheartedly suggest checking out the IGN Japan version of the footage, which is what you're seeing in the background here. Not only does it play out in actual 60 FPS on performance mode, as opposed to the English version which was played in 30 but rendered out in 60, so it doesn't look quite the same, but the IGN Japan version features an entirely different playstyle to the one seen in the English video. So first and foremost, the game looks absolutely fantastic when in motion. They are playing on performance mode, and even with all of the particles and the quick movement, it doesn't seem to be dropping any massive frames. And that mid-fight cutscene looks absolutely fantastic, with Shiva or Jill pulling off the classic Diamond Dust move, which seems to freeze the arena. All in all, the gameplay pretty much speaks for itself, though I am quite curious to see what this boss fight looks like when it's played out in Ultimaniac or Final Fantasy mode. I believe the Liquid Flame boss that you're seeing here, and that I think we've seen flashes of in some of the trailers, harkens back to the Liquid Flame boss from Final Fantasy V, I believe. Not a game that I'm necessarily familiar with, but I always think it's cool to see throwbacks to older titles in a series. As soon as this video was released, a lot of you came to my comment section asking me what is up with this specific dodge animation, especially considering it's so jarring and it's not something that we've seen before. As I've mentioned, this isn't something that I saw at all during my entire play session or hands-on session with the game. If I had to take a guess, it could be a few things. The first of which is the fact that this person is playing with the accessory that slows down time whenever an attack is coming Clive's way, allowing you to dodge more easily, and that animation is specifically tied to that accessory. Or perhaps whenever they're using the precision dodge, they're directing the analog stick backwards, allowing Clive to dodge back instead of to the side. I've also noticed that throughout this gameplay, sometimes when this person does that jarring dodge, they don't end up actually following up with an attack, which may be why it perhaps can look quite stilted or janky with the camera simply following Clive as he slides away. Though I may be wrong entirely, so let me know your thoughts on the whole dodge situation down in the comments section below. With all that said and done, it has been me, DevilNeverCry. I'd like to thank all of you for watching, and as always, I'll see you all next video.